Well, hello and welcome to Future Medicine AI. My name's Harry. I'm the editor here, and today I'm here with Mary Jane and David, who are doing some very exciting work over in Canada at the largest mental health hospital in the country. So, we're going to be talking about some very exciting AI projects and work that they're doing over there. So, I'll hand over to Mary Jane first to give an introduction and tell us both a bit about what you do.
So thank you very much, Harry, and welcome to your role. I'm very excited to be on the editorial board, and I knew that I would be thinking about what can we offer to your listeners, and thought immediately of David Rotenberg. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. I am a lawyer. I work at Inc. Law, and I've had the tremendous opportunity over the past many months to step into a leadership role at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. It's located in Toronto. As you said, it's Canada's largest mental health and addiction hospital, teaching hospital. And really to know better what CAMH is doing today in terms of data and our patients and the opportunities to really drive forward using AI is very much not just on the horizon. It's not just an enabler, it's a driver. So a real pleasure to be here, and we'll definitely kick off the discussion. I will hand it over to David for a moment to just comment on the role that he has.
Thanks, Mary Jane, and thank you, Harry. Excited to be here. I wear a couple hats at CAMH. I'm the Chief Analytics Officer, thinking about data all the time, thinking about analytics and what we can do with it. And I'm also Operations Director of the Krembil Centre for Neuroinformatics, which is really at the interface of all the different types of research data, how we integrate those together across the hierarchy of the brain, and also link that with clinical data where it makes sense to do so. CAMH is a phenomenal organization continuing to evolve and iterate and innovate every single day, and it's really a thrill to be part of it.
Thank you
I
both
would say
very
we have a
much.
new strategic plan. Harry, sorry to cut you off.
No, not at
We have
all.
a new
No,
strategic
that's
at CAMH, and a lot of
Mhm.
thought went into what we want to do over the next 7 years. And data is at the core. Everything, of course, is about our patients and a modern health system. Knowing, machine learning and AI have been around for a long time. There's much more focus on AI and across the sector, across the globe, to be frank, because of generative AI. And
Mhm.
so to know that the Krembil Centre is doing the work that it's doing, and I see David and team underpinning in many different ways all of the work of the hospital. How can we modernize and create good digital health? How can we harness machine learning and AI? It's just very exciting. It's exciting uh, in the mental health and addiction sector, probably over many years. It's a sector that was waiting for its moment. There's much more funding, I'd say, globally for mental health and addiction. There is less stigma. So this is not just about CAMH, it's just this exciting opportunity. We'll be together in September at a World Hospital Congress in Rio talking about these very things. And mental health has its time in the spotlight and deserves these new technological advances, the innovation. So it was very exciting. As I said, it was part of the reason that I stepped back in, having done work with CAMH some
I
years
think
ago.
what you
This
guys
is the truly future.
yeah, I think what you guys are doing is so exciting because again, as hospitals they can sometimes be a bit behind the curve in terms of technology adoption and sort of things like that, and I think bringing the level of innovation and trying to build what you guys are trying to build with all of this data that you've got, I think it's such an amazing and exciting project, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it.
Can I throw one thing out there? I guess to
Mhm.
both of you, just given what some organizations are doing, it's still on the minds of many. Maybe not every organization has stepped forward to say, I'm putting my hand up, I'm going to create an AI strategy, data strategy, but it is on people's minds. I don't think any organization has just set it aside entirely to say, oh, well, that will never impact us. I think we're
Mm.
far past that. And so I guess a question would be, um, you have FMAI, you have other organizations and collaborations. How do we also share out there anything with organizations that have not taken those first steps formally? Because I'm really mindful, we work in Canada in a public sector health system, government funded. And the fact that, these are early days, they're earlier for some than others. How do organizations share that knowledge in a meaningful way? Because otherwise, everyone will be doing it off the side of their desk. So, David, what do you think? You're out there doing it alongside peers. Your role at CAMH is probably um, newer than for every other healthcare organization around the globe. How do we do
Right.
that? How do we share
Yeah.
it as we're building?
It's an excellent question, and it's true there aren't that many CAOs around, but we have been working closely with our colleagues in our local TASN network, the Toronto groups that are looking at these problems, and everyone's really trying to solve the same fundamental problem, which is less about the technology as it is about how you implement this safely and how you do so in a public healthcare environment. So we've been working closely on that. We actually had a proposal that's gone out as a recommendation for what the governance is, but it needs to go beyond that. And I think one of the points that we touched on briefly, but that I think is very important, some of these things have been tackled in acute medicine, but very much less so in mental health. And as you said, mental health is having a moment. It's time to seize on this as an opportunity to explore all of these types of questions in the context of mental illness and mental health in general. And so I think it's important to form a community, not just with other hospitals, but people who are looking at mental health beyond the walls of an individual hospital at the national level, at the global level. And so there are forums, I think, that are growing to be able to share this information. But I think we may be lacking a fundamental infrastructure, if I can use that word, for how to share this type of learning in the mental health space.
Harry, what do you think about that? Again, in the role that you are in and harnessing it across the world and creating these opportunities to have rich discussions, I would say at CAMH, we're also doers. We often use it's not just problem solving, but it's solutions, not answers. So
Mm.
Yeah.
how do we impart, how do we help, how do we learn? Because I would say, David mentioned the TASN group, the Toronto Academic Health Sciences Network. That's the teaching hospitals in a relatively sort of close geography. So again, we don't reinvent the wheel every single time because a lot of the same issues cross the desks of the VP's research, of the CEOs, of the privacy people, of the people doing research. How do we make that broader from your perspective and sitting where you sit in this role with FMAI? What are the practical ways to continue to do it?
I think this is such a good question, and partly it's a really good question because it's difficult to answer. Like I've been sat here thinking while David was talking, what my response to this would be, and I guess there is a fundamental need for a lot of institutions to uptake artificial intelligence in their workflows, not only from a competitive perspective, because I think if in a lot of cases if people aren't integrating this kind of technology into their businesses, then they will fall behind the curve and they'll be at a competitive disadvantage. So I think there's a fundamental need for a lot of people to adopt it. But in terms of your question about how you almost increase accessibility to AI tools and AI adoption across industries, I think that's a really challenging one. And I think one place that can come from is government level incentives and training programs, or just platforms that are really good at sharing information and yeah, I think it's a challenging one, but I think government incentives can have a role to play in this from a higher level. If people want to learn how to be able to integrate these technologies into their businesses, then there needs to be platforms for them to be able to do this. And I think it also relies on people who are in, for example, DevOps and even ML ops, so teams that manage the computational infrastructure of these businesses. There needs to be an opportunity for them to be able to integrate this kind of technology. And there also needs to be accessibility to the kind of hardware and infrastructure that they need to be able to do that, and also the funding that they need for that. But I think it's really challenging. It's a hard question to answer in terms of increasing accessibility, but I guess from my perspective, yeah, just trying to create an open environment to share information rather than hoarding it and, you know, making
Mm.
everything so proprietary. I think open discussions and, open source stuff is really helpful for that as well, because it helps everyone learn.
And I'll offer to a couple of layers on top of the discussion.
Mm,
The regulatory framework is not
Mm.
robust everywhere in the world. We know
it's
that
very
we've
true.
got the EU AI Act making its way and great progress. Uh, Lots of developments in the US. Canada has been looking at addressing this within its Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act. We have jurisdictions, we have provinces and territories, each with their own health privacy statute. So what do we do in that case? Are we going to be addressing autonomous decision systems the way we may with the federal um, progress as well? The Canadian government has invested, they've announced their investment, and David, you can correct me on the number, is it 2.3 billion upcoming or maybe underway or
Yes.
so, if that figure is correct?
It's
And
interesting
it's
because
broad. It's going to, yeah, go ahead.
I was actually reading just before we started recording this that the UK government, under the new UK government, there was a 1 point something billion-pound investment in like a new supercomputer
Mm.
for artificial intelligence that was going to be built, and they've actually pulled the funding for that due to budget cuts and things like that. So they've pulled back on a lot of funding here. But not to digress too much, touching on the point of regulation, though, I think that's a very large barrier to a lot of businesses not understanding, or not businesses, institutions, not understanding where they sit from a regulatory perspective. Can they do this? Can they do that? What what layers of complexity are there to be able to use this technology? And I'm sure you have experience with that,
Yeah.
David. Well, both of you.
Yeah, I was going to say there's just a lot of uncertainty, and exactly as you said, when can you move forward? Where are the true barriers and how you would overcome them? It's something that's been answered in so many other areas, but it comes up in every conversation that I have. And there's a lot of bright people, and people are trying to build things that are going to probably potentially help a lot of individuals, but they're kind of stuck in limbo with these questions. And it certainly is a barrier to scaling, which is always a good way to really make innovation available to different partners. And as you mentioned, Mary Jane, globally, if these things can really help, we want to be able to have a way to not have it stuck, permanently unable to move between countries and jurisdictions.
That's a great point. On the regulatory front, it's not as though everything happens in isolation in the EU or in the US, Canada, elsewhere. And so, from the point of view of a company, a global company, we've done training with global CIOs who will say, "Listen, I've got to deal with this across the globe. I have 29 CIOs of my own, and we are struggling to get to the right standard." And then it does raise a question as well. In the absence of certainty, what do we choose to do in the meantime? What we
Mm-hmm.
don't want to do is do it 3 or 4 times downstream because we were so off base. But what is there not a prudent, of course, the things that lawyers will say, prudent, diligent, robust path forward based on best practice? That was the second part of my comment, which is we've got the regulatory gray, if you will. And then on top of there's some amazing work being done. There are think tanks, there are all kinds of groups focusing on AI. So I think that's extremely exciting. I watch on LinkedIn and participate. But thinking even back to a couple of years ago when we were talking about AI ethics, and
Mhm.
I think we did a count at one point, and there were 80 plus. I don't know, maybe you'll tell me now there are 200 standards on AI ethics. And we talk about AI risk assessment and bias and everything else. So, what is the consumer to
Mm.
do in that instance? We've got ISO, we've got NIST standards. It's all really great. But again, from the solutions, not answers, or when I look at one of those standards and think, okay, this is really great. There's a risk management standard. I'm going to make my way through it. I'm looking at the schedule. And then I'm thinking, always, how do we implement? How do we choose the right one? Or do we simply say, well, we're just going to choose and we're going to go forth because we're not going to wait for that regulatory framework, and we have things that we want to do in the interim.
Yeah, I think that part of what you also mentioned, Mary Jane, is that at CAMH we are doers. We do want to be able to move this forward and certainly weigh the risks and understand what the downstream impact could be and be judicious in our investments, but also acknowledge the cost of not moving forward.
Yeah.
And I think there is a real moral imperative in exploring these data and seeing what we can do with them. If we can actually make treatments better, if we can actually direct people to the best paths for them to get care, we need to explore it, but do so in a way that is safe. And so some of the governance that I've seen that we've implemented is pretty common sense in that you take things in stages, you evaluate it, use your best judgment, use standard risk profiles to identify where you can go, where you don't go, where it's appropriate to stop and rethink it. But I think we need to begin to pursue this. We need to begin to not be too cautious, but still put up barriers that are appropriate that fundamentally protect the patient and their autonomy. And with that in mind, I think we can do no harm, but still be able to progress the field in a way that will lead us to clarity when we get that. We don't control that, but we still need to be bold.
Yeah.
And I'd also add, and maybe, not only about CAMH, I've worked for a couple of decades in the health sector. I've done a lot of mental health work. I know years ago, a person with a mental illness or addiction wasn't even necessarily engaged in the conversation, not about AI, because that was not the focus those years ago, but there might have been decisions about, well, we won't approach people for fundraising, or we won't approach people for research. And the patient engagement piece is really critical. I've said for years, and it's one that I think CAMH does very well. It's foundational. Um, I've just said for years there has to be a better true story about data, and this goes, David, to what you said about the moral imperative.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we not having the conversation more broadly in the public, not just with patients and their families, about the incredible things that this can bring to the health system, and have that feedback, hear what people's hopes and dreams and fears could be, and not be stuck saying, well, we clearly can't move until everyone else does, or until there's a clear regulatory framework. I would say the people drafting are having the same conversations. How much do we do? Do we wait? Do we model after anyone else? Do we go forth and lead? How can we be diligent? And how can we actually advance it?
I think that
Harry, what's your
I think
thought?
yeah, I think that's a fantastic way of putting it and showing, what CAMH is trying to do differently. And I think it's a really nice segue also to talk about, how did this sort of begin, this project that you're doing, how did this begin at CAMH? And, how did you start to even face these hurdles that you're talking about? Because obviously you're at a stage of innovation where you've been pushing for it for a while. So, how did it all start? And also, how are you engaging the patients as well? Because you're talking about engaging patients in the journey of data and how it can empower them. So I'm really interested to know, how you've navigated that.
I think those are all very much related and essentially so. One thing that I say often, I think my colleagues agree, is that it's not super difficult to create an algorithm. You can make a pretty accurate prediction of certain things. But what's really important is what are you predicting and how do you use it? What is the actual mechanism where clinicians are making a decision? What do they really implement? And to do that properly, you must consult deeply with clinicians and with patients. And it's a simple case where you look at something like medication adherence. If there's low trust and patients don't take their medication, in many cases, they will not get better, as in the case for acute medicine and mental health. And so that process of consultation, of education, and of understanding the problem very deeply from the perspective of the patient, the clinician, not only will you simply not be able to implement an effective intervention with AI, but you could be causing other downstream problems that weren't foreseen. And I think that's both the heart of the governance model we've implemented, which is working closely hand in hand with our partners and stakeholders. But it's also on the other side important to share our learning back to full circle some of the other points of the conversation, educating the rest of the community on what we can do and what some of the very real barriers are. And as an academic teaching hospital, we have a very real role in doing that, and also influencing the policies as they move forward, particularly in mental health. So I think that patient, family, stakeholder consultation is critical across all of these areas.
I'd also do a shout out to the research endeavor because CAMH, it's the cornerstone. It's a place where we talk a lot about data, robust research ethics review, and everything else. There's another body, not just at CAMH, but an IRB, the Institutional Research Ethics Review, REBs in Canada. These are bodies. They typically would have a lawyer and a privacy person, clinician, community member. You think about the questions that are put to them today that are quite different than they may have been years ago. Now, questions about data, it's not just, well, what's the data flow? What data elements are going to be exchanged for the purpose of a given research project? Suddenly, we're also talking machine learning and AI. So there's another body, but at CAMH, the research is growing exponentially. We have an ability to really have that data conversation and sort out the data strategy. We're also putting up a tremendous new research tower. The innovation is going to be a visual as you walk onto this beautiful campus.
Oh, wow.
Where we do this work day to day. And again, it's all part of where has mental health, where has addiction been over time, and creating this center. We have this incredible opportunity with data, with research. We have the Krembil. So, David, maybe just take a moment to comment on how long has the Krembil been in place and how did it come about? I think that'd be really interesting for the group.
Absolutely. And I'm also glad you mentioned the Discovery Center, which will be a brand new home for our research overall. And of course, the Krembil, it will be a showcase, I think, for Toronto and a beacon for mental health. So the Krembil started in 2016. I have to think back a little bit. And the underlying principle was first an acknowledgement that we don't know what causes mental illness. But we do believe that there is a biological cause. And that by bringing together interdisciplinary scientists who look at the genes and the microcircuitry in the whole brain, really understanding the breadth and depth of the structure of the brain from all scales, and underpinning that with computational methods, because to do this, you have to crunch a lot of numbers. It's complex from an analytics perspective. We can tackle these collectively. And so the Krembil Centre was built and funded through very generous and visionary contributions from the Krembil Foundation to put together this remarkable team of scientists and technologists to wrangle all these data, these very diverse data sets, make them available for analytics, and probe these questions at all of these different levels to try and determine from different lenses effectively where mental illness might be propagating and how it might express itself within, again, genes or individual cells, all the way up to how someone presents at the clinic. And so it's been a pretty remarkable few years of growth of the teams, of growth of the scientific output, and some phenomenal groundbreaking publications and grants. And I think that we've been able to push mental health into the forefront on the computational perspective, certainly nationally and globally, and collaborate with those folks. If we think about knowledge sharing, it's been a great vehicle both ways to put this question out there at large. How do we tackle this massive challenge of understanding mental health from a computational and data perspective?
Thank you very much, David.
I
and thank you,
say,
Mary, for the great question. Thank you very much. Yeah. No, that's fine. Thank you for the great question. I was just wondering, Mary, do you want to go first? Sorry. Also, it's fine because we can just any bits that are sort of overlap, we can just cut them out or whatever. It doesn't matter if there's it's fine if there's an overlap or something like that.
Yeah, I have this can be edited out, but I have two things I want to raise. And what's the comment for those who don't have a Krembil, who are not at that stage, because there's a lot of development in mental health apps, self-help,
really
different vendors coming and knocking on the door, etc. So that's one thing that I'm going to say. And then I just wanted to sort of, again, refocus on the opportunity of the data. But okay, so let's pretend. What do they do? They clap.
That's right.
All right. So we want to ask as well, given what you've said, David, not every organization is going to have a Krembil Centre for Neuroinformatics. Not a large group of data scientists. Maybe, if we're lucky, one person will come in and wear a hat that deals with these types of things. There are vendors, especially post Gen AI, knocking on the door of different organizations saying, hey, I have a solution. In the health system, many organizations have either Epic or Cerner or a Meditech or other information system. And a lot of those large vendors, rightly so, are also collaborating and bringing in other vendors to work with them to integrate into their solutions. And so I just wonder if an organization is still at the outset, we've talked about, well, maybe we'll have some certainty at some point downstream on the regulatory front. We will continue to see standards proliferate and discussion. If we want to be really applied and kick it off, my vote is start with your data strategy. I don't always use data governance anymore because it doesn't land as well, but what is your data strategy? So I say start there. Think about what data do you hold? Where is it? Can you use it? I'm going to just suggest, as important as they are, privacy and security, very, very important, because if you're not doing those well, nothing will happen. Let's assume that we would be able to say, yes, those things are working well. As we move down that continuum into identifying appropriate use cases, AI governance, and then the action. What's your thought then, either of you, and we'll start with David, for an organization that is just dipping their toe in the water of the data strategy? Because I guarantee organizations are having those conversations. Okay, so what are we going to do? How do we start? We're not CAMH with the Krembil. Where do we start?
Right.
So David.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Jane. I think the way you articulated it was very accurate in that you've got to start with the data. And people, of course, are eager to jump towards AI. It is a shiny object at the moment, and for good reason. But you've got to have a fundamental understanding of what data you have, and critically, the quality of those data. Because again, you can implement an algorithm and it can appear accurate, but are you working with data you can trust, that you can rely on? And one of the key principles that's been very important for us, and I mentioned all these different types of data we have to stitch together, is interoperability. And we have very real cases where we have individual data sets from clinical that are important and valuable. We want to ask questions of those data directly alongside HR data. So the number of nurses against the particular care that's being delivered, how that relates to financial performance, how that relates to research. And so taking a strategy that is really cognizant of the uniqueness of the data and their respective quality and relevance to the business, but how you can make them interoperable is really important, because otherwise you'll still have a bunch of silos, and that does not work for complicated questions that help drive the business forward.
And Harry, from your point of view, because you're certainly in a position to have your finger on the pulse, do you hear from organizations, or are you in circles where people are saying, yeah, we want to kickstart this, but we're not sure where to start? Or maybe some are coming and saying, oh no, we're just going to go full steam ahead to what David just said. Oh, we're just going to adopt that.
Yeah,
off the
so
side of the desk.
I think I've not come across particularly businesses that, from my interactions, it may be because of the area that I'm, focused. I've not come across businesses as such who are looking like they have no clue where to start. But I've come across a lot of businesses that are trying, who are on the other end of it. They've got products that they're trying to bring people on board
Right.
with, and I think your point about interoperability is really important, and I think that's really key for anyone planning or wondering whether they can do stuff with their data. Is, it's not as simple as it seems from even the most fundamental perspective. Like, if you have two different pieces of data, it's a massive challenge to get them working together. And also, if you have these businesses that are offering services as well to come in and work on your database, like, that's a lot of work to, even for example, here in the UK, the NHS, every clinic and every different hospital has different ways that they run their systems, different ways that they log their information and things like that. So it's a really big challenge. And although I haven't come across, had conversations with people who are really looking to, like, don't know where to start, I have spoken to people as sort of word of mouth that there are a lot of people who are in that position, that it's just so overwhelming, and it's very difficult to know where to start with it, and expensive as well. Cost is a huge hurdle.
You did mention and I'm thinking you're talking the third-party vendors who would like to attach themselves, provide their product and service to be able to assist. I think that's a big challenge in the health sector, at least. I think there are lots of ways people come in. They may come in, attached to a clinician who comes and is very excited. Here's what we could do clinically, and then here's something about the data. I've heard some of the vendors say, well, that's great, but it never converts beyond a pilot. And then I'm sort of left with it. And certainly in the health sector, again, where there are some big purveyors, the IT side of the house, the information systems, when you are Oracle Cerner and Epic, and there are solutions that are being vetted. Again, I think it's great. How do we make it work at the front line is my other mantra as well.
That's
but
a really good
even
one.
in the funding that Canadian government is giving, as I mentioned, it's very broad. Some of it's being set aside for creators who are being impacted, as we know, by generative AI. Some of it's going to, the computational question of, again, do you stand up your own? Do you attach to another group with the computational power? So many issues to consider. So I have a feeling this is the start of the conversation. I'm going to ask David, would you, knowing the years of the Krembil and the evolution of your own career, would you have thought this was where it would be more generally, less so about CAMH, but just where we would be as a sector. Because I can only imagine in the next 5 to 10 years where we might be. It's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the lessons I took from my graduate work, which was medical biophysics, where you took physicists and you taught them biology and biologists and you taught them physics, is the intersection of disciplines and how you can benefit from different types of thinking. I'm going to say interoperability again, because there's so much you can gain from combining different types of approaches. And I do see that proliferating. Certainly, the Krembil Centre is a good example of that. But I think if we talk about the example you were giving, Mary Jane, about how we bring technology in, that is fundamentally an interdisciplinary question from my perspective. It's a data question, it's an analytics question, it's a human-centered question, it's a business question. And so I think as a field, as AI is maturing from just a technology into something we're using every day, that human-centered perspective and that interdisciplinary acceptance of what you really need to make something work is the glue. And I'm not saying that's a magic bullet, and I think it's going to be a different playbook for every organization depending where they are. But I do think that just that ability to keep an open mind and understand the different components you need to make any technology work is really critical.
Yeah, it feels like the next layer. I'm thinking about some work that we did. Again, it was during COVID, so I'm trying to think. A couple of years ago, in any case, during COVID, we delivered across Canada a national roundtable. It was on mental health and apps, mobile apps for youth. So now we've moved beyond mobile apps, but this was kicked off by Yuri Quintana at Beth Israel Deaconess, Dr. Farouk Naeem at CAMH? I'm just trying to.
I think it's still going. I actually have to pull it back up.
Yeah. And so this group looked at mobile apps. This was not about machine learning and AI, but the clinical piece, the efficacy of what was being adopted, the privacy, the security issues. And it was, again, a very rich, multi-day discussion of how do we do this right? How do we do it, period, because, or question mark, I should say. My father was a lawyer, my mother was an English teacher, so I'm caught. How do we do it? But we must do it. But we wanted to look at, and I think we can extrapolate into, all right, machine learning and AI today as we start to integrate the technology or build it from the ground up or get help to build it from the ground up. What do we want to achieve with it, or what is the baseline that we have to have in place in order to say, yeah, we're adopting that and then we're going to move it forward? Again, I think we're doing it. At CAMH, we're certainly doing it, but I think this is the mobile app 2.0 at some level, but with a whole lot more layers around regulatory. But I still think that the clinical, what's the clinical benefit? What is the efficacy of what we're proposing? Do we have privacy and security in hand? Maybe there are other layers, but I would just comment on that maybe in 5 years we'll be talking about something quite different.
I think the main piece I would pick up from that, and it's more on the business side, but what is the return on investment? And I find that's very much missing from a lot of the apps that I've seen pitched, or technologies I've seen pitched, and it follows through directly to AI. And yes, AI is exciting, or this new technology might be exciting, but is there demonstrated evidence that it's going to have an actual return for the business of running a hospital, which is a real thing? We need to actually keep the lights running. And of course to patients and what the balance is there. And I rarely see, both when an organization is planning a project like this, if they expect an ROI and what that's going to be, and that case being made from the apps and the different applications that have come forward. So I wouldn't want to lose sight of that.
Yeah,
thank you both.
That's fair.
Yeah, thank you both very much for your comments there. It's really interesting. I was just wondering, there's a lot of points there that I'd like to touch on about specifically about how CAMH are going about, how you're going about what you're doing. So I'm interested to know an overview of the pipeline. Essentially, how is it? How are you, what data are you using? How is it being used? And just some examples of some of the research that you're doing, and some of the exciting applications that you've got for this data, and how you're working with this opportunity cost almost of doing such research.
I'm going to say one thing because I think this is definitely a David answer. I'm just going to preface it with, we know we have the data. We know what the opportunity is. We're also really fortunate. We have a very strong and curious and diligent board.
Mm-hmm.
So from the front line, as we collect the data, we make sure we've got the rigor in it, we've got the opportunity. We mentioned the strategic plan. We've got an excellent senior, sort of an executive leadership group. Lots of focus on the talent to make a priority, to have someone like David in this role, a strong VP of information management in place, straight through to the board. And again, boards of organizations or shareholders, they all bring their own expertise. They all see some of this in the day to day. So of course they also have questions. What are we doing? So as to what we are doing, I'm going to put that over to David to answer.
Sure. Thank you for saying all of that, Mary Jane. I absolutely echo that. I think it's a remarkable organization that has made some excellent decisions about how to structure a lot of what we do. So one thing to start off is research is this open space, and we always want to keep it an open space where exploration and discovery can happen, but also have a way to, in a principled way, bring those types of discoveries into the clinic. And that's always the tricky part. And so we started with a very governance first approach in that, how do we make decisions about what's a priority, going back to the ROI point, what's actually going to help drive our strategic plan of all the different ideas and potential AI applications. And then how do we go through a process to determine, one, its feasibility? Is it actually going to work? Do we think it's going to work? Can we look at the data and determine whether or not there are biases, both in the original training data or the input data or in the predictions? And then how do we follow that through with an approach that allows us to take things offline if they're not performing to the standard that we've set, be that in terms of performance? And there's always a different balance of false positives that is appropriate depending on the use case, being very clear on that. And I'd say that this whole process is identical between something that we have developed ourselves that we're transforming in, either sort of de novo or from research, or from something that's coming from industry. We want to hold it all to the same standard, that it meets our criteria. We can run it in a way that protects people, that we can demonstrate is effective, and that we can control to the point that if it is not working, we can safely bring it down and take a principled approach to restoring that service if appropriate. So we've been very successful so far. It's an evolving process, though. Full recognition that, as we've said, the industry is changing, the environment is changing, but as long as we have a structure that is sufficient but also flexible, we can continue to move things through in a way that is responsible, but also that will respond to all the changes that we may hear the next day, tomorrow, the next year, whatever the case may bring.
Thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive explanation. Well, a very comprehensive strategy that you've got there as well. The way that you talk about it, you can tell that it's sort of ingrained in what you've been doing. Like there's so many layers to this to this story, and I think what you guys are doing is a real example of how to do it properly. And Mary Jane, your expertise goes hand in hand with that as well from a governance and legal perspective. And I guess to lead on from that point as well, what are some of the research applications of the data that you're working with? So what kind of projects have you produced?
Yeah, I'm glad I gave my first answer because there's so many research projects I had to think about it for a while. Um, So one thing that we're really interested in and we've been working on for a little while now is the application of wearables and being able to measure things like activity and sleep. And sleep is actually impacted and negatively impacted in pretty much every mental health condition that we observe.
Wow.
And so, can it be an early indicator for different things? Does monitoring it help? The other interesting part is people are notoriously poor at understanding their own sleep. So, if you kind of woke up and said, I slept really well, if you actually had measured it, perhaps you didn't, or vice versa.
I feel that.
Right.
And
I
so,
see.
yeah. And so objective measures are really important things for mental health care. If we can measure it
Yeah.
accurately and give that information back to clinicians, that's really useful. So we've implemented different wearables in different conditions in outpatient clinics and soon inpatient clinics. Use algorithms to predict whether you've slept or not, or what those stages are, and return those back to physicians more or less in real time. And that has the goal of informing our doctors with real-time information that reflects how people have actually experienced sleep and then correlate that with the care and treatment that they're getting. So it's still early days in many respects, but I think this is promising because it's an objective measure. We can push into the general realm of psychiatric care.
And I wonder if we could take a second as well, just to, and maybe David, your input on brain health. Obviously, we've got
Mhm.
this Krembil Centre for Neuroinformatics. Brain health, again, is one of our, like the raison d'etre. We talk about mental health and addiction. Can you
Yeah.
comment on some of the work being done across brain health and how it's come together? I think of things like the Ontario Brain Institute.
Yeah.
I had the good fortune of being at a brain health nexus roundtable in Washington a few months
Yes.
ago. Just remarkable to think as you don't just look at one discipline and you go across and you've got the data, what
Mm-hmm.
can we accomplish?
Yeah, I think that it's phenomenal. It's, I think, just a good shift in terms of the overall conversation we're having about mental health is brain health. And I think it's helpful for a few reasons. One is that it is a biological explanation. It's the brain and the body to different extents, but certainly the brain, which helps us combat stigma, I think, in a very real way. And it also reflects more and more so the lifespan. And if we think about our heart health, there's kind of a general understanding of what you need to do to care for your heart over time and how that might change with different age ranges. But similarly, the brain changes between infancy through adolescence to adulthood to older age. And so taking a lifespan approach, or the brain health lifespan, as we also talk about, is really important. So it's recognizing it as a functioning core component of our physical health, that allows us to look across the lifespan and explore where early intervention also may have long-term impacts. So we've just seen an increasing emphasis on youth studies all the way across the lifespan to support for those in older age. And I think it is an important concept, an important shift in the field to talk about brain health.
So exciting.
Absolutely.
It's
That's
so
yeah. There's limitless applications to the kind of information that you've got. And I was wondering, David, how are we doing for time? Because I noticed it's
So I promised a hard stop because I
yes.
got the timing wrong and I said I was free at noon, and so Lee had to change her schedule. So I'm gonna
that's fine. That's
gonna
absolutely
hard
fine.
stop.
Okay, well, I
Yeah.
guess I'll ask you sort of a bit of a penultimate question then about what
Mhm.
is, because AI's been around for a long time. It's changed a lot over the recent
Mhm.
years. And what's your, well,
Yeah.
recent years, recent months, what's your vision for your work and in the next 5 years, or what's your vision for what you're doing?
Right. Thank you, and thank you again for all the phenomenal questions, Mary Jane and Harry. It's just been a pleasure to talk to you. So First, I really see AI as being just a component of our day to day. It's going to be embedded in every piece of technology. It almost already is. But I think the potential promise of this is to work as a support function, so hand in hand with human judgment, being able to predict things that allow us to automate tasks that are not great uses of folks' very highly expertise time, but that provide this scaffold with useful information at our fingertips in a way that is automated and structured, that fundamentally augments the practice of medicine and certainly the practice of mental health care. And I genuinely believe that it will help serve patients across all the different potential disorders, but also at a population level. We didn't talk about that quite so much, but being able to predict trends and shifts that can inform governments and policy is another application that I think is very real and potentially very impactful. So I think the future is very, very bright, obviously, but there's plenty of work to go, plenty of barriers to overcome. But as I said before, I think it's critical to stay bold and to move forward as long as you do so in a principled fashion.